Buenos días, mi nombre es Gerardo Otero, soy el expresidente inmediato de LASA y me tocó este año ser el coordinador del comité de Kalman Silvert Award. Entonces les voy a leer cuáles fueron los resultados de este premio, que es el principal premio de LASA, y lo voy a hacer en inglés. Susan Eckstein, que está por acá, Professor of Sociology and International Relations at Boston University and past president of the Latin American Studies Association, was selected as the 2023 recipient of the Kalman Silvert Award. LASA's Silvert Award Committee agreed with her nominators that Professor Eckstein is highly qualified and richly deserves this lifetime career recognition on the grounds of prolific, high-quality, interdisciplinary scholarship, truly exceptional service to LASA, and broader service to the profession. On her wide-ranging scholarship and multidisciplinary impact, Professor Eckstein has been a highly productive scholar whose work has been influential in several important subfields of Latin American studies. She has written and edited 9 books focusing on 3 countries, Mexico, Bolivia, and Cuba, with systematic comparisons to additional Latin American countries. Her books include such influential works as The Poverty of Revolution, The State and Urban Poor in Mexico, published by Princeton University Press in 1977, and then Back from the Future, Cuba under Castro, also published by Princeton in 1994, and Power and Popular Protest, Latin American Social Movements, a UC Press book published in 1989. These are classic works that would be on the required reading list of any course on contemporary Mexico, Cuba, and social movements in Latin America. Eckstein has remained an active scholar in the areas of Cuban studies and U.S. immigration studies, producing work publishable by the best academic presses in her field. It is certainly unusual for a scholar in the 6th decade of her career to produce a single-authored volume of the quality and significance of her latest book from 2022, Cuban Privilege, published by Cambridge University Press. Beyond persuasively documenting the preferential treatment of Cuban immigrants, particularly the earliest generation of overwhelmingly white middle-class Cubans, Eckstein shows that the US government began privileging the entrance of Cubans as a tool of Cold War foreign policy with Cold War aims, such as undermining the Castro government, and diverging from this path became politically prohibitive for US politicians, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Eckstein demonstrates that this privileged relationship with the US government has much to do with the fact that Cubans have done better than other recent immigrant groups in the United States. Thus, her book offers an attractive analytic model for future studies of immigration and immigrant integration, regardless of nationality. Eckstein's research for this project was supported by an impressive array of prestigious fellowships, including awards from the Guggenheim, Ford, MacArthur, Tinker, Rockefeller, Russell Sage, and Christopher Reynolds Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute, and the American Council of Learned Societies. On the transformative service to LASA, probably no one has done more to create LASA as we know it today than Susan Eckstein. During her presidency from 1997 to 1998, she secured the first major contribution to LASA's permanent endowment, a $2 million gift from the Ford Foundation. This support enabled Latin American scholars to become active in the association, attending LASA congresses, participating in sections, and serving as elected officers. The committee members enthusiastically agreed that Susan Eckstein is a worthy successor to the LASA members who have been recognized in this way and an inspiration to future generations to pursue her brand of wide-ranging, multidisciplinary scholarship coupled with deep and committed service to the profession. So the Kalman Silvert Award committee members were, or are, myself as past president from Simon Fraser University, Gioconda Herrera from the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, Flaxo, who is a LASA past president, Mara Viveros Vigoya of the Universidad Nacional de Colombia, also a LASA past president, Carmen Martinez Novo of the University of Florida, and editor-in-chief of the Latin American Research Review, and Ronald Chilcote of the University of California, Riverside, who was the 2022 Kalman Silvert awardee. And with that, I'm going to let Susan do her presentation. Well, the way I thought of it was that you would do the presentation first, and then other people will talk. And then if there is time, we'll open to the public. Huh? I know. Yeah. After your talk. I thought that was preferable. And I will introduce the next speakers as they come along. So let me. These can be your cursor or your pointer.
Oh, I see. No, I'd rather do the other one. This, right?
Oh, well, that's to move along.
Yeah, to the next one. Oh, I see cursor, but I have a,
Oh, you have a pointer. Okay.
which I think, I'm not sure. Does that work? Where is it? Is the cursor better, do you think, than the? What do you want? I want, so you see, okay, maybe this is better. I've never done. Okay, well, thank you for coming, and thank you to the awards committee for very generously choosing me as this year's Kalman Silvert Award committee. I also want to thank the select people who have been invited to say a few words about my work as it connects to their work and the work of others in the field, but you're going to have to wait to hear from them. I thought they would come first, but anyway, so can you hear me? Is this okay? So the inspiration for my talk, partly, well, I really owe it to LASA, and if this becomes a book, I must say I've put this talk together for the presentation, have not written on the subject, and the slides I've been drawing from various places, so they're not in perfect format, and so I apologize for that. There was perhaps the most famous address by a president of the American Sociological Association, and I am a sociologist, was by George Homans, who was a professor at Harvard. His talk was, I believe, in the 1960s, and the talk was bringing men back in. Now, what was significant of that title was when men, right? He would never get away with that today. But leaving that aside, the point that he was making is that he was critiquing the models, sociological theories that were very abstract, like the Talcott Parsons, et cetera. And he felt very moved from reality and society that sociologists are supposed to study. So what I am arguing is on the need for us to bring people back in, and particularly immigrants back in, on which I will be focusing. And I am going to be discussing ways in which immigrants have been transforming and transnationalizing the Americas, okay? So let's see. I could not resist this slide. I've thought about taking it out because there are too many slides, but this is, to me, was remarkable. We all grew up, birds migrate, but here we are, that the people of Latin America are joining the birds. And it also reminded me of one of the early important books on immigrants by Michael Piori called Birds of Paradise. So anyway, there it is. Missing from our analyses of Latin America, missing from our analyses of development and strategies of development and theories of development are the role of immigrants, ordinary people. So just as background for what I'm talking about, I'm just very simplistically and simplifying some of the characteristics of contemporary Latin America that are plaguing the region, that have fueled first domestic migration or rural to urban migration, and now most recently in recent decades, international migration. So high inflation, high poverty rates, remarkably, about a third of the population of the region is said to be living in poverty, particularly in the context of the pandemic, that most of the labor force is informal, meaning they have no protections, no guaranteed wages, no guaranteed health care. And so it's a life of insecurity as well as poor conditions. Adding to that have been problems of widespread crime, widespread violence that have been on the increase. And then we have to add issues of climate change and how that has been affecting the region. Drought, hurricanes, floods, and also politically, what we've been experiencing is what political scientists have referred to as democratic backsliding. So the democratization of that really the region experienced in many respects in the course of the 80s has been slowly being eroded. Our models of development, ranging from import substitution to neoliberalism, have provided no solution to the problems that have been plaguing the region and have exacerbated some of those problems. So here I want to demonstrate the urbanization of the region. What is remarkable is here is Latin America.
The slides are not being viewed by people online, so we're going to have to make a
Okay.
Quick adjustment.
Technical adjustment
Yeah.
for the people who are not here. Sorry, great, no problem, thank you. So what you see here is how high the rate of urbanization is in Latin America. It is almost as high as it is for the United States and Canada, which is remarkable, and is even higher than it is in Europe. The difference is that Europe and North America have much stronger economies, so the urbanization is associated with much higher employment, with higher good employment, et cetera, than is the case of Latin America. But the other point is Latin American cities are saturated. There is little room for them to grow demographically. And if you compare Latin America to the other countries of the global regions of the global South, you can see how much more urban is Latin America. So against that background, one also has to look at what are the conditions in the cities to which Latin Americans have been flocking in the last half century or so. So I'd say these are guesstimates, but the data that I pulled together, for one, shows you the problem in Latin America, as many of you probably know, is not unemployment. It's not unemployment because the countries don't have a universal unemployment insurance system. So people have to find some way to eke out a living without it. And so what is much more telling is the number of people, again, these are just guesstimates, who are living in the informal sector without any, securities such as guaranteed wages, pensions, healthcare, et cetera. And looking specifically at the industrial sector, which you would think of as more privileged because they do have more securities, what you would find using 1980 as the base is that barely have industrial wages increased. And this is and the minimum wage has deteriorated since 1980, before the crisis that led the debt crises and the transition to neoliberalism. So urbanization, you can see, has been no real solution to the problems that are plaguing the region. And here is some data specifically on inequality, which has always been a major problem in Latin America, at least since the colonial era. And what you see here is that since 2000, the rates of inequality happily have been coming down in the region, but remarkably, the inequality in the cities, within the cities of Latin America, the red line, what we're seeing is that inequality now is bigger, greater in the cities than in the countryside. The countryside, since the colonial era, has been remarkably associated with tremendous land inequality, the distribution of land, and in turn in income. And now we're seeing that the rates of inequality are greater in the city than in Latin America. Again, sort of another indicator that the cities are not resolving the problems of poverty in Latin America. So that gets us to immigration. So first, what we had seen is this enormous migration from the countryside to the cities. And now what we're seeing is this huge increase in immigration, in part because the cities haven't been solving the problems, and in many ways have been exacerbating problems for Latin Americans. So Latin Americans have increasingly picked up their bags and left. No one wants to leave their homeland by choice, but the conditions are such that they see that their future is much greater in emigrating than in staying at home. So here I put together data on migrants as a percentage of the homeland population, and I've put in bold the ones over 20%. 12 of the key 20 countries in Latin America have over 10% of their population now living abroad. Imagine 10% of Americans picking up and going. We would be horrified and stunned, and that we've just been taking for granted in the context of Latin America. And the rates of urbanization are particularly high in El Salvador, Venezuela, and Jamaica, that Latin American Studies Association doesn't pay too much attention to, but there it is. Some people, like I believe you did an earlier book on Jamaica, right? So anyway, so I want you to see how important, significant demographically is migration in the context of Latin America. So what are the reasons for the surge in immigration? I cannot, if I'm going to finish my talk, I just have to be very simplistic about it. But, it's multifaceted, and I would say the reasons are interrelated. Economic is obviously key, that increasingly Latin Americans see no economic future for themselves in Latin America. But the reasons have also been social conditions in the cities, gangs, violence, etc. have been other reasons. Environmental factors have contributed to immigration, particularly Central American and Caribbean countries that have been hard hit by hurricanes and earthquakes and the like. And politically, conditions also have contributed to the immigration, but I personally don't think it's a primary factor, but a contributing factor. But like the democratic backsliding, etc., I think are some of the factors contributing. But conditions are so bad that, particularly in Central America, families have sent their children to the United States unaccompanied, obviously on the idea that their children could do better abroad than staying at home. So coming into the United States, this has been brilliantly documented recently in the New York Times articles. They are highly exploited in this country. So they're contributing to wealth that's being generated into the United States, which by people who are not legally qualified to work, according to our labor standards. So now to turn to the US side of the equation, what you see here is the green is the immigration to the United States from the Americas, mainly from Latin America. And what you see here is that in 1960, the immigration from Latin America was actually low. It was under 20%. Most immigrants were from Europe. But what you see steadily over the decades is that by the turn of the century, half of all immigrants to the United States are from Latin America. And look what's happened to Europe. Europe has almost disappeared, not direly, but heavily disappeared from the pool of immigration to this country, which is remarkable because in 1950, this is 1960, 1950 was even more of our immigrants came from Europe. And they were favored by our immigration laws that were highly racially biased towards people from Northern Europe. With the immigration reform in 1965, we got rid of the national origins quotas, which were the basis of this racist immigration to the United States. But the reason that immigration from Europe has picked up is not only because they got the US law eliminated their preferential treatment, they don't want to come here anymore. Conditions in Europe have improved so within their own countries, within the European Union. So in their place have come predominantly people from Latin America. In very recent years, Asian immigration has been picking up. So you can see the green here where the Latin Americans are accounting for slightly less percentage of immigrants to this country since 2010. Okay, but they still are the vast majority, as you can see here. So where are they coming from? And what you see here is that actually this was new to me because I focused mainly on Mexico and Cuba, countries in the Caribbean and Central America. So what you see is that of immigrants from Central America and the Caribbean, they mainly come to the United States. 89% come to the United States. So that is really the path of immigration. This contrasts with what's going on in South America, where you see most immigrants are internal to South America. This is, for example, represented by Venezuelans going to Colombia, Bolivians going to Argentina, etc. So there is this other immigration pattern in our backyard that is going on. And I'm sorry, and secondly, they're even going more to Europe, for example, to Spain, than they are to the United States. So different patterns of immigration in the two regions of Latin America. But what you can see here is that, I don't know how to minimize me. Can I minimize me? I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of this statistic. I think I can't do anything. Okay, I think it's something like it's 40. It's 6 times more. Okay, 6 times more people are coming to. Yeah. Okay. Great. Or maybe on the very bottom. Okay. Okay. Okay, great, thank you. So what you can see is the vast majority of immigrants are coming to the United States. There are these different patterns, but the point is there's much more immigration coming from Central America and Mexico. And so you have this very differential distribution of immigrants in the Americas. So here, what you can see now, I'm really seeing the impact of immigrants to the United States. Okay, I'm shifting a bit from Latin America, where they're coming from, and now looking at their coming to the United States and their experiences in the United States. So what we're seeing is okay, I'm sorry, a little bit is covered up, but what you're seeing is this huge increase of the Hispanic population in the United States. It's increased over tenfold since 1970. So in 50 years, the Hispanic population in the United States has increased over over tenfold. No, over sixfold, sorry about that. So a vast increase. And now looking at what's happening to them here. Here they're coming to the United States because conditions have been so bad in their homelands. What's happening here? It turns out the streets are not all paved with gold for them. And this is some data found on poverty rates. And what you see is that Hispanics, what? No, I don't need it.
And for the title.
Oh, he wants me to tell you the title, which is covered up.
I know it's covered up there.
Yeah, so it's the poverty rate by race and Hispanic origin, 1959 to 2019. Yeah. So, you know, it's basically since 1960, that's over 60-year period. So what you're seeing is that the rates of poverty vary by ethnicity and by race. And here's the non-Hispanic white that has a relatively stable rate of poverty of a little over 7%. Asians are doing very well, at least compared to Latin Americans, and their poverty rate has come down. Okay, it starts up here and it comes down, and it's the same poverty rate as for non-Hispanic whites. In contrast, the rate of poverty for Hispanics is very similar to that of Blacks. Okay, some years the rate has been higher than for Blacks, and other years it's been lower than for Blacks. And according to this data, it's 15.7% of Hispanics are living in poverty. So, and the rates have not come down too dramatically. They've come down a little, but it does show you that there is, you know, 15%, over 15% of the Hispanics are not doing well in the United States. Now, this table that I extracted has somewhat different poverty figures, but here what I want to show is the importance of citizenship. And if you come down here, you'll see that the poverty rate for this is poverty rate for Hispanics. Almost a third of all Hispanics who are not citizens are living in poverty. This table shows you the importance of citizenship. An issue that is so critical as our Congress resists putting through a new immigration reform to legalize people who have been living in this country for decades and decades without legal rights, without rights to vote, without rights to work, without rights to welfare, etc. And so you can look at the other figures too. I really wanted to show you how important being a citizen is in this country. The rates do vary by nationality of Hispanics. And if I had more time, this of course is very important. Not all Hispanics are alike. But here, what I think is interesting is one, that the rates of poverty have gone up among Mexicans. They've gone up among Cubans, which is this one down here. And they've come down among Puerto Ricans, which is nice, but Puerto Ricans are citizens. And yet, despite being citizens, they have a really high rate of poverty. And it's really, I think, one of the tragedies of this country that exists and that it exists over time. So, yeah, this one is Cubans. So the rate of poverty has gone up among Cubans, reflecting changes in who's immigrated from Cuba. And this is another category down here that I'm sorry, I'm covering up. So now what do the Hispanics, Latinos, Latinx, whatever you want to call them, here I have it in the original slides, but whatever that group called them. And so this is a Pew study of what they call Latinos in the United States. And what you see that despite, the large number who are living in poverty, you're seeing they think they're better off in America, which helps explain why they stay in America, right? Opportunities to get ahead. They seem to think it's better for them than their children, which is remarkable. And access to health care is better than in their homeland. Treatment of the poor is better. The one thing that they don't think is better in the United States is the strength of family ties. And here you see they have a much better sense of family relations in their homeland. And this shows you the cost of immigration, what it means to the families that immigrate. It's at the cost of their families. They don't, as we'll see, they don't necessarily completely disconnect from their family, but you can't live the same way across borders as you can within your home country, hometown, etc. So here, I'm now switching from the impact in the United States to seeing the impact that the immigrants have in their homelands. And most significant is the contribution that immigrants from Latin America make to their homelands. This is remarkable because of the high rates of poverty among the immigrants, that despite that, they sacrifice a large portion. You may find, and I've seen data on this, that immigrants making $20,000 are sending a third of that back home. So a deep sacrifice to their own adjustment, economic adjustment to the United States, immigrants are sending money back home. And it is, in a sense, part of the immigration contract, if you will, that immigrants may come individually, but they are coming often as a part of a family project. The families support their most able bodied, like most likely to earn money, members of their family to immigrate, with the assumption that they will share of a part of their earnings with their family back home. And immigrants feel a moral obligation, even when they're earning so little in this country, to share it with their families back home. So here you can see the tremendous increase in remittances, an indicator of transnational ties of the immigrants, going up from $22 billion in 2001 to 20 years later to $127.6 billion. So the immigrants have had a tremendous, made a contribution in terms of remittances to their homelands. And basically it dips a little bit with the Great Recession, but then rebounds and goes up to a record high. So here, this was data from the, I think, Inter-American Development Bank, which shows you from the point of view of family back home, how important remittance can be for them. So in El Salvador, 28% of the population, of adult population, receives remittances. That's a huge percentage of the population. The percentage is slightly lower in Guatemala, and you can see it then goes Mexico a bit lower, Honduras, and then Ecuador. So it's not in all countries the same, but I sort of wanted to pick up some data that shows really how central remittances are as perceived by the families back home. Here, what you're seeing is that not only are the immigrants making an enormous contribution to their families, they are making a major contribution to their economies of their home countries. So here what you see is that, that Honduras, the most, with 29%, El Salvador, Jamaica, Guatemala, Nicaragua, over 20%. Remittances account for over 20% of the GDP of their home countries. Amazing. A fifth of the economy is dependent on these poor immigrants. Okay, and then this is some other data. So the importance of remittances varies very much by country, which is, don't have the time to go into it. And Mexico, which actually receives the most remittances, it's a smaller part of the general GDP because the economy is so much larger. Here, some data on the US portion of the remittances that are received by the home countries. And here what you see is that, not really surprising, but I think it's interesting to document that in the case of the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Mexico, most of the remittances are coming from the United States. Less so in the case of Colombia, because they're part of this other immigration pattern within Latin America, within South America, that's headed more to Europe or internal to South America. So this has become a new way, really, of US economic influence over Latin America. This to me is remarkable, some data I put together on hard currency, which is of course so central to the countries of Latin America. What you're seeing is immigrants are adding over 100-fold to the economies than is US foreign aid. As Biden very recently was claiming very proudly, we're going to give $1.4 billion to Latin America in the form of aid. Hello, look at the remittances, what they are doing, as opposed to what the rich US government is doing in our backyard. And even it's remarkable, it's not that much less than foreign investment. So bottom line, immigrants are having an enormous economic impact in their homelands, and not only for their families. So now I want to talk about immigrant impact cross-border. Okay, I've talked about immigrant impact in the United States, then immigrant impact transnationally in their homelands. And now I want to look at it across borders. And I'm really just pulling out a few points that I think are kind of interesting. So one is to look at the influence from the US to Latin America. Economically, we've already discussed. Cultural influences, migrants when they go home, and they don't even necessarily have to go home through Skype, through WhatsApp, whatever, they're having conversations back home. They are bringing US culture to their homelands, not necessarily giving up their homelands, but introducing American cultural values and practices, consumerism, fast foods, and music. American music is also very popular. Politically, it's not discussed that much, but the US, Latin American politicians come to the United States to raise money for their campaigns back home. So they're becoming sort of politically tied to the United States for their political success back home. And most recently, I'd say still in a very nascent stage, we're having voting abroad, such as Brazilians in the United States, at least in key cities, being able to vote for elections back home. So we may see much more of this trend over time. And so what you're seeing is across borders, political dynamics are being institutionalized across borders. The other direction from Latin America to the US, I think the first one has to recognize is the cheap labor that Latin America is providing for the US economy. Culturally, it may surprise you, but at this point, more salsa is consumed in the United States than ketchup. What do you think Heinz is thinking these days? So cultural immigrants are coming with their own cultural tastes and disseminating Taco Bell, etc. So it's becoming more and more part of the American diet, but it's through immigrants that this has come to the United States. And politically, those Latin Americans who are citizens, who can vote, are becoming important in key states in the United States. New Mexico, it's a small state, but the Hispanic population is very large. So those who are citizens are having a big impact on the outcome of elections there. Florida, the largest swing state, but also the third largest state now in terms of electoral college votes, has a very large immigrant population, particularly Cuban, but not only Cuban, and in consequence has a big impact on immigrants, on elections in the United States. Socially, you're having kind of transnational ties with immigrants and their families going back and forth across borders, contributing to a fluidity. So in other words, immigrants have really are remaking the Americas. It's not all that good. And what we find is, although those of you who were born in this country, we grew up in land, America's the land of immigrants, the Statue of Liberty, welcoming all immigrants. United States has really a whole other history as well, and that is of restricting immigration, and this is massively enforced today. And so I want to highlight a few of the ways now that the US is trying to block Latin Americans from coming to the United States to improve their life. So one is denying entry, limiting the visas for people to immigrate legally to the country, detention and deportation of visa-less entrance. And that, as I'll show you on a slide, both of those have increased dramatically, particularly since the Reagan administration. Detention has picked up. And then expulsion at the border. And this really has picked up under the Trump administration and carried through with the Biden administration until just a week or two ago, when Biden ended so-called Title 42, was a health law that was buried in the books that Trump somehow was able to dig up to, in the context of COVID, a health issue, to block immigrants from this country at the border. And so 2 million, I mean, the estimates vary, but about 2 million immigrants have been expelled at the border. So they're not getting in and detained and deported, but not even getting in. Okay. And the other thing is those immigrants who make it through these barriers and are unauthorized in this country, they don't have legal rights. So you're giving them no rights, economic rights, political rights, etc. And the other thing that's a kind of a in-between category is the granting of temporary immigration rights, which have expanded, but at the expense of permanent immigration rights. So many of you may be familiar for TPS, temporary protective status. And Biden seems in the midst of expanding temporary immigration statuses, in part because he can't get a new immigration law through Congress, and Congress, in theory, regulates immigration. It is not temporary entry is at presidential discretion, but Congress has to regulate actual immigration. And very recently, in January of this year, Biden just introduced another large parole program. Parole it gives you legal rights to be in the country, free from deportation, rights to work, no path to citizenship. So it's a temporary status. And that was used for decades to allow Cubans to come in the United States until President Obama, in his last week in office, ended Cubans' parole rights. But now Biden has introduced a new parole program for 2 years, supposedly, temporary entry rights with, to come in, to be able to work and be free of deportation. And this program is for Nicaraguans, Cubans, Venezuelans, and Haitians. So it's limited and which immigrants qualify for this. And it doesn't begin to meet the demand among even those countries, much less the ones who are not included. So, what am I doing? Now I want to discuss a few ways of restriction that I think most people in America are oblivious to, and that is the outsourcing and offshoring of immigration control. The US is not alone. Europe is doing the same. And so here are some of the ways in which this is occurring. One is the US is pressuring Mexico to block transit immigrants. In the past, Mexico gave a transit pass. They could go freely through through Mexico and get to the US border. And then immigration was the US problem, not Mexico's. Well, under pressure from the United States, Mexico has had to stop doing that. The United States has given military and other assistance to Mexico to try to block immigrants from south of the border from coming. And that is how most unauthorized immigrants are coming, or almost asylum seekers are coming, is by land. So also it's pressured Mexico to deport immigrants. So again, so they don't come to the United States and become the US problem. And Mexico, I mean, Trump, for example, has used economic threats to get Mexico to do these things. And it threatened to impose tariffs on Mexican goods and steep tariffs if Mexico did not behave the way Trump wanted them and sort of do our dirty work for us. Then there's a so-called asylum ban, as it's come to be called. And this was introduced by Trump, fought in the courts, and strangely, Biden is reintroducing it. And that is to require unauthorized immigrants who are trying to come to the United States to claim asylum that they need to apply for asylum in the first country through which they pass. So you may be a Cuban wanting to get to the United States, and you're going trekking through Central America to get to the US border. You got to get, if you're going like if Honduras is your first country, you're supposed to apply for asylum there, et cetera. So it's trying to get immigrants who seeking to come to the United States to be blocked from coming and forced to get asylum in countries that they first traverse en route to the United States. Also, the US has pressured countries to introduce visa requirements which it turns out keeps a lot of immigrants out. In the case of Cuba, for example, the path that Cubans started to take had been through Ecuador, because Ecuador did not require a visa. And so Cubans would fly to Ecuador, get into Ecuador, and then they would trek with human smugglers through Central America to the US border. But other countries have had these visa requirements as well: Costa Rica, Mexico, Panama, etc. And the one country that removed a visa requirement was Nicaragua. And guess what? Once that happened, for example, it became the new route by which Cubans would come without authorization to the United States. So they'd fly to Nicaragua, and then they'd hook up with human smugglers there. It shortens your trek, makes it in principle less expensive and less dangerous. The worst place is the Darien Gap, separating South and Central America. And now the most recent thing Biden has introduced, I don't know if they've actually opened up, is processing centers in Latin America. So what that means is you apply for immigration in the countries where they set up these centers. It's a way of blocking aspiring immigrants from getting to the US border, keeping immigrants out. At the same time as giving some the rights to a visa. So here, just quickly, is some data on deportations. And what you can see is bipartisan, okay? Clinton and Obama have have kicked immigrants out as much as others. So Obama became known as the deporter in chief, but he is in quite good company. And what you're seeing is a steady increase in deportations. Trump is lower. I believe the main explanation is because he was so massively kept immigrants out of the United States. So there were fewer immigrants to deport. So by his other strategies, he kept them out. And here is estimates of unauthorized immigrants in the United States. Again, these are ones who've made it through all these hurdles. And there seems to have been a leveling off of unauthorized immigrants, largely explained by more immigrants from Mexico returning to Mexico than coming since 2012. I think that has a lot to do with that. And here is, to me, a remarkable chart, because what you're seeing here is evidence of Mexico now deporting more immigrants from Central America, from Guatemala, Honduras, and Salvador than the US is. So Mexico is really serving as the handmaid, if you will, of the United States, but really doing the America's dirty work. So the United States doesn't get accused of deporting so many immigrants. So in sum, I hope I haven't talked too long. A few points to highlight. One is immigration is central to Latin Americans today and to Latin America today. The Latin Americans in this process are seeking their own solutions to the problems not of their making, problems that are embedded in, centuries, if you will, of problems in the region. But they are facing incredible, formidable exclusionary barriers. Meanwhile, despite these barriers, immigrants have come to have an enormous effect, an increasing effect, both on the United States and on their homelands. So in short, we need theories that take people into account, bringing men, not men back in, as George Holman's titled his talk, but bringing immigrants into our theoretical understanding of development in Latin America. And we need policies that address the needs of people in Latin America so they can stay in their homeland and not immigrate, and not do as our vice president said, immigrants or asylum seekers, I can't remember what she said, go home. The point is we have to help create better conditions for them in their homeland so that they can stay and lead decent lives in their homelands. That's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Susan, for this great and depressing summary of the immigration trajectory of the policies of the United States. So now we're going to have several colleagues of Susan that have either been within the same field of study or some former students. And so I'm going to call you according to the order that I have here, and I'll let you know what the order is. William LeoGrande first. Is he here? Oh, he's online. Oh, okay.
I am here.
All right, good. So let me just say a couple of things about William LeoGrande is a professor of government at American University in Washington, DC, and specializes in U.S. policy toward Latin America, particularly Cuba. He is the author of Our Own Backyard, United States in Central America, 1977 to 1992, published in 1998, and co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, 2015, published. He's also the co-editor of Cuba at the Crossroads in 2020, and a contemporary Cuba reader, The Revolution under Raúl Castro, published in 2014. So, William, go for it.
Thank you very much. And first, thank you, Susan, for inviting me to join this distinguished panel of colleagues. I'm honored by the opportunity and only sorry that I can't be there in person. I met Susan around the time that the first edition of her book, Back from the Future, Cuba under Castro, was published in 1994. It is a really outstanding and in-depth look at the development of revolutionary Cuba up until that time. And I assigned it as a main text in my class on Cuba for many, many years. A lot has happened in Cuba since the last edition. And so, Susan, now that Cuban privilege is finished, I hope maybe you'll consider going back to the future and give us a new edition of Back from the Future. But for anyone new to Cuba, this is still an exceptional analysis of the first 5 decades of the revolutionary process. What makes it so valuable is that it looks beneath the surface of stated policies and their ideological explanations or rationales to really explore the structural constraints on Cuba's political economy. That is to say, the material conditions that limited Fidel Castro's options and channeled his decisions. So Susan concludes rightly that many of the decisions made in those early decades were dictated as much by economic necessity as they were by the ideological preferences or imperatives of the revolutionary leadership, which is to say, Fidel made history, but even he didn't make it just as he pleased. In recent years, of course, Susan has focused on the Cuban diaspora and the threads that connect Cubans abroad with their families who are still on the island. Her earlier book, The Immigrant Divide, How Cuban Americans Changed the U.S. and Their Homeland, was one of the first really in-depth studies of how the Cuban American community began to reconnect to the island in the 1980s and the 1990s, building bridges based mainly on family ties and especially on remittances. She just showed us how important remittances have become all across Latin America. In Cuba, this is especially true. I was struck by the fact that 20 some odd % of many Central American families receive remittances. In Cuba, it's over 50% of family that receive some level of remittances. And ever since the special period in the 1990s, remittances that Cuban Americans are sending to their families have become a really essential component of the standard of living of literally millions of Cuban families. That's a really stark reality, demonstrated by the current humanitarian crisis on the island. That's a result, that resulted when first Donald Trump put restrictions on remittances, made it very hard to get them there. And then COVID-19 made it hard for Cuban Americans, in fact, impossible for a while, for Cuban Americans to even travel to the island and carry remittances by hand. Now, of course, Susan's most recent book, Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America, really reverses the lens to look not at Cuban immigrants, but rather at U.S. immigration policies that brought them here. It is the definitive account of how Washington, motivated by the Cold War, gave Cuban immigrants really unprecedented privileged access to the United States and gave them unprecedented support once they got here. Key elements of that privilege remain in place today, and they are exacerbating the current migration crisis out of Cuba, which is really at an all-time high, as Susan discussed in her panel presentation yesterday, specifically focused on Cuban migration. So this book has gotten a lot of attention. Most of the time, we academics toil in relative obscurity, writing for one another, in hopes of contributing new knowledge to our chosen field. And sometimes we write for a broader audience, hoping that our expertise might impact public policy, have a positive impact on public policy. Most of the time, and I can speak from experience, this is like screaming into the void. We have no idea if our contribution to the public debate makes any difference or if anyone is actually listening to us. Well, people were listening to this book. Susan's latest contribution is really a cautionary tale of what can happen when the public does take notice of our work. Many of you, I suspect, are aware that she endured 30 minutes of hate unleashed against her during a book presentation in Miami. It was really a disgusting and disgraceful display on the part of far-right elements of the Cuban American community, and all because she had the nerve to state the obvious, that Cuban immigrants to the United States have enjoyed enormous privileges that no other immigrant group has enjoyed. And to say that is not an attack on Cuban Americans as it was portrayed. It's just a simple truth. It's a shame and a puzzle to me, actually, why Miami has retrogressed to an atmosphere that is really reminiscent of the 1970s, when it was physically dangerous to express a contrary opinion on Cuba. But leadership, or I guess the lack thereof, has a lot to do with it. Susan, it took real courage to present this book in Miami. It took even more courage not to cancel when you became a target of far-right social media. And it took astonishing grace and fire, astonishing grace under fire to remain calm and collected in the midst of the circus atmosphere that you were subjected to. So Susan, congratulations on this very well-deserved award and on a career that has helped us all better understand Cuba, Cuban Americans, and all the other contributions that you've made on social movements and on Mexico.
Thank you very much, William. So I've been asked by our boss today to shorten introductions. So don't feel bad if, I say less than you sent me. So the next speaker is going to be Wayne Cornelius, who is a distinguished professor of political science emeritus at the University of California, San Diego. His research has focused on contemporary Mexico and U.S. Immigration and asylum policy in cross-national perspective. His work has been cited more than 15,000 times in refereed journals, and he is also a past president of LASA and received the 2020 Kalman Silvert Award. Wayne.
Set this over here. And we've got a mic here. Better. Great, thank you. Delighted to be back at LASA after a hiatus of about 15 years. And appreciate very much the invitation that I got from Susan to be part of this panel. Like myself, Susan Eckstein began her career studying internal rural to urban migration. We both somehow ended up studying squatter settlements in Mexico City in the very same year as graduate students. And then we both moved on to international migration. Whether it was Mexico in my case or Cuba in hers, we both felt the tug of international migration, not just because transnationalism was such an important part of people's lives in Mexico and Cuba, but because there were compelling policy issues relating to international migration that intrigued both of us. For example, selective treatment of immigrants according to their nationality has been one of the true constants of U.S. immigration policy. During most of U.S. history, immigration policy has been biased for or against specific national origins groups. And that selective treatment continues right up to the present. It's not just the most egregious cases like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, our programs for resettling refugees from World War II and the early Cold War were also often nationality specific. So they were X number of slots for Greeks, X thousands of Germans, and so forth. We have often claimed and enshrined in our laws that migrants of any nationality can seek asylum if they meet general standards of persecution. But in practice, our policies have often been designed to punish or reward immigrants of specific nationalities. As recently as 1990, the US Congress saw fit to pass a major piece of legislation whose primary goal was to facilitate immigration from Ireland. In fact, it was known as the Irish Bill. And since February of last year, the US has found various ways to admit over 300,000 Ukrainians, though not on permanent visas. So what's so unusual about Cuban privilege? All of us who work in the immigration field have long had a kind of vague sense that Cubans were being selectively rewarded by the system. But there has been little understanding of the specific mechanisms and of the shifting official justifications for these policies. Susan's book brilliantly deconstructs the Cuban privilege that's baked into US immigration law and policy over the years from Eisenhower to Trump. She draws on extensive archival research to explain what has been done to selectively reward Cuban immigrants through a broad range of entitlements not available to other nationalities like Haitians and Dominicans, whose very different US experiences Susan analyzes comparatively in her book. She also demonstrates how the preferential treatment of Cubans was path dependent, such that one set of key benefits granted to Cubans but denied to immigrants of other nationalities became the building blocks for subsequent Cuban entitlements, even after the original Cold War related justifications for preferential treatment for Cubans ceased to exist. The latest iteration of nationality-specific immigrant policymaking also involves the Cubans. It's the humanitarian parole program announced by the Biden administration on January 5th of this year. Under this program, up to 30,000 two-year visas are being issued each month to nationals of 4 countries: Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Haiti. This program has little to do with rebuilding our asylum system writ large after Donald Trump dismantled it. Instead, it's aimed at putting out what the immigration policy hawks in the Biden White House regard as the political dumpster fire on the southern border. Specifically, using an authority granted to the president by Congress in 1952, the new program creates a legal entry option for at least some of the migrants who have been surging from the 4 targeted countries. It also discourages illegal entries from these countries, people who don't come via the parole program. If you present yourself at the border without prior approval to enter via the parole program, you'll be deported immediately to Mexico and banned from entering the US for 5 years. By targeting these 4 problem nationalities, quote unquote, the administration hopes to bring down overall unauthorized encounters and deflect criticism that Biden is doing nothing to secure the border. But there are no slots in the program for nationals of other countries who are fleeing the same collapsed economies, food shortages, hyperinflation, and gang violence that are driving people out of the 4 targeted nations. In fact, migrants now showing up in large numbers at the US southern border who originate in 5 other countries: Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Guatemala, and Honduras, are almost as numerous as those coming from the 4 favored countries. But there's no place for them in the new program. Even for the 4 targeted nationalities, the demand for parole visas vastly outstrips the supply. From January through April of this year, more than 1.5 million applicants were received from persons hoping to sponsor migrants from the 4 countries for a program that is capped at 30,000 visas per month. More than 400,000 Cubans, would-be sponsors of Cuban migrants, have applied to the program, about 1 out of every 4 applications. That's not surprising because the program requires you to have a financial sponsor in the US. Cubans have extensive, better integrated social networks in the US, so they're more likely to have relatives with the means to support them for 2 years. Plus, Cubans have an especially strong incentive to participate. Under the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966, they can get permanent resident status just 1 year after entering via the parole program. Can the new legal pathways sustainably deter unauthorized migration from these 4 countries, absent a dramatic improvement in their economies and deep investments in creating alternatives to immigration? The early answer is no. There is no evidence that U.S. policies have deterred citizens of Biden's 4 parole countries from leaving home. They're still fleeing, but many of them are stuck in the Darien Gap and elsewhere along the migration route rather than showing up at our border. Here's the takeaway. Targeting specific nationalities amounts to politically expedient firefighting. It's not thoughtfully designed, humane policymaking. It's a poor substitute for comprehensive legislation that would expand the number of permanent resident slots for all would-be immigrants, or for raising the annual cap on refugee admissions from all countries. And finally, the temporary nature of grants of humanitarian parole is a huge drawback. Most expire after 2 years with no pathway to permanent resident status. They are acts of presidential discretion that can be invalidated by lawsuits brought by Republican officials or rescinded by the next president. Congress isn't likely to pass another open-ended Cuban Adjustment Act benefiting other nationalities in the foreseeable future. In fact, Congress is even deadlocked on passing the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would create a path to permanency for the 75,000 Afghans paroled into the country since the US troop withdrawal. Unfortunately for the Afghans, it's Ukrainians who are the nationality du jour in Washington. In any event, when Susan gets around to a revised, updated edition of Cuban privilege, she will have yet another fascinating example of Cuban privilege to decipher for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. I think I'm going to really cut down on the bio profiles because we have 4 more speakers, so I think each will have about 3 minutes. So we now have Dr. Soraya M. Castro Mariño, who was a full professor and senior researcher at the Center for Research for International Politics at the University of Havana.
Buenos días. Honrar honra, dijo José Martí. Por ende, me parece que este premio, y muchas gracias al comité selectivo y a todo el comité ejecutivo de LASA, que siempre han hecho un trabajo magnífico, por invitarnos a este panel que de alguna manera honra la obra de Susan Eckstein. Y debo decirles que probablemente voy a romper con la lógica que han seguido los ponentes anteriores, puesto que esta solicitud de hablar sobre la obra de Susan es probablemente una de las tareas más difíciles que LASA me ha dado. Esa organización que con tanta devoción ha promovido e impulsado los estudios sobre América Latina, dedicarle unas palabras a Susan resulta profundamente complicado porque ella constituye una inspiración y uno habla no solamente desde el profesionalismo, sino también desde el cariño, desde el respeto y desde una gran admiración. No voy a referirme en detalle sobre todo los libros, que lo tengo aquí, pero Gerardo, LeoGrande y Wayne hablaron sobre ello, pero sí debo destacar que la obra y los libros académicos de Susan Eckstein, de altísimo rigor científico y de investigación minuciosa, también se combinan con una tarea muy digna, la enseñanza. Susan ha sido profesora de generaciones de estudiantes y es profesora de profesores. La 6ª mujer electa como presidenta de LASA durante 1997-1998 llegó a Cuba y ahora les voy a hablar una cubana sin privilegios, una cubana que vive en la isla, en un momento extremadamente complejo en la República de Cuba. Era complejo para la Academia Cubana y era muy complejo en las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos. Susan justamente llega a Cuba después literalmente, prácticamente, de de la crisis de los balseros en 1994, y Cuba se debatía en lo que hasta entonces había sido la mayor crisis socioeconómica y política del país, que como ustedes saben, como buenos cubanos, eufemísticamente llamamos periodo especial, que ni fue un periodo ni fue especial. En este sentido, a mí me parecía también impresionante que la presidenta de LASA llegara a Cuba en un momento complejo en las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos, porque justamente en 1996, como recordamos, había tenido lugar el derribo de las avionetas de Hermanos al Rescate. Y todo el entorno, tanto para la academia en Cuba como de las relaciones Cuba-Estados Unidos, era muy tenso. Pero Susan llegó a la isla con esa sonrisa que ella tiene al estilo de la Mona Lisa de Da Vinci, con esa capacidad impresionante de escuchar y al mismo tiempo defender a capa y espada la inclusión y el aumento de la participación de los profesores y académicos cubanos en los congresos de LASA. Entonces, no sé si recuerdan, pero a duras penas funcionaba el correo electrónico, y en Cuba había un módem que de alguna que otra vez se conectaba y pitaba, ¡pri, pri! Terrible las comunicaciones. Por lo tanto, cuando Susan Eckstein llega al aeropuerto José Martí de La Habana, veo a una señora con un cartapazo de volantes, de flyers, con la convocatoria literalmente del Congreso de LASA para Chicago 1998. Esta acción de Susan provocó que por vez primera muchos académicos y profesores cubanos que viven en la isla supieran de la oportunidad de compartir ideas y conocimientos a través de la posibilidad real y concreta de participar en un congreso de LASA. Y esto lo supieron gracias al viaje de Susan a La Habana. Con esa tranquilidad externa que la caracteriza y esa férrea voluntad que lleva adentro, que fue demostrado literalmente, LeoGrande nos recordaba la desagradable experiencia al crear un meeting de repudio en Miami cuando se presentó su libro The Cuban Privilege. Pero hay que tener mucho coraje para no cancelar y decir voy, y voy a la boca del lobo. Y Susan con esa tranquilidad se aparece en los lugares y en los momentos más complejos que pueden existir. Y yo pienso que es porque está convencida de que el conocimiento y el intercambio de ideas nos hace pensar en la posibilidad de la construcción de una academia más democrática y participativa. Les juro que no voy a hablar como cubana. Ya lo sé, pero no se preocupe que no voy. En medio de tanta responsabilidad, y aquí quiero rescatar también algo importantísimo de la obra de Susan como ser humano y como presidenta de LASA, en medio de la responsabilidad de poder llevar a LASA tecnológicamente a lo que es el siglo XXI, en medio de un trabajo sumamente intenso que fue la inclusión bastante masiva de la participación de latinoamericanos y latinoamericanas que viven fuera de Estados Unidos a participar en los congresos de LASA. Esto provocó también la posibilidad de una ampliación de la participación de los académicos latinoamericanos en los congresos de LASA a través de las becas y, por supuesto, el apoyo que logró Susan por parte de las distintas fundaciones a LASA. Pero en medio de toda esta complejidad, Susan se tomó esto personalmente. El Congreso de LASA era en Chicago, y para todos los cubanos que vivimos en la isla es sumamente complejo. Cornelius tiene también una gran experiencia de que los académicos cubanos que viven en la isla logren una visa para participar en un congreso en los Estados Unidos. ¿Y qué hizo Susan? algo que algunos de mis colegas decían, no, eso no se hace. Se montó en un avión, se fue a Washington, D.C., entró al Departamento de Estado y dijo, a los cubanos hay que apoyarles y darles su visa académica para participar en el Congreso. Y lo cierto es que la participación de los cubanos de la isla en el Congreso de LASA Chicago fue el mayor hasta ese momento y de alguna manera rompió el impasse de que participar en LASA era de alguna manera un sueño utópico. Por último, sí también quiero subrayar esa capacidad que tiene Susan de potenciar una mayor participación también de mujeres y jóvenes en los congresos de LASA. Esa infatigable labor que ha devenido, en mi opinión, en un modelo de estudios interdisciplinarios de tipo comparativo, influye en la actualidad y nos impulsa con su ejemplo a intentar seguirla en ser cada día mejores académicos, pero también mejores personas. Para mí, Susan ha sido, es y será un paradigma. Y no, para no repetirme más y para que Gerardo se tranquilice, voy a decir en magnífico y buen cubano callejero, Susan, eres lo máximo.
Lamentablemente nos quedan solo 6 minutos y tenemos 3 colegas más para hablar. Entonces, pues mucha brevedad. Yo creo que ya nada más voy a decir sus nombres. Carmen Diana Deere, que es también expresidenta de LASA, también fue distinguida con el Kalman Silvert Awards en 2018.
Gracias, Gerardo. As Gerardo mentioned, Susan served as president of LASA during 1997 and 1998, and I'm honored to offer a few brief comments on her service to the association. In those days, presidential and DC terms were 18 months, so one could get quite a bit done. Moreover, combined with 18 months as president-elect, 18 months as past president, one served a total of 4.5 years in the leadership of LASA. So potentially one had enough time to have an impact on its direction. Well, I think all of us would agree that all LASA presidents work hard, but I think it's fair to say that few presidencies have been as successful as Susan's. Under her leadership, LASA embarked on what was then a novel experiment in democratization, the creation of LASA's current structure of sections organized around thematic and country interests. Susan also demonstrated formidable fundraising skills, securing major grants that have had a long-term impact on the development of LASA. In the interest of time, I'm only going to say something about the sections, because it's good to have some of this historical background from those of us that are still around to tell it. Prior to the late 1990s, the main way that members could participate in LASA, besides attending the congresses or being elected to the executive council, was through the LASA task forces. And membership on these was by presidential appointment. Well, as often happens, many of the appointments ended up being one's friends, or at least people that you knew. A big difference in LASA's evolution was that for its first 25 years or so, what reigned was the old boy network. In the early 90s, this changed with the election of a series of women presidents. But the new girl network that emerged did not function much differently. So this is the context in which Susan proposed the radical idea of abolishing these centrally appointed task forces and letting members organize themselves around their own interests. The idea of creating more space for member participation was, of course, appealing. But many of us, myself included, were skeptical about how such a decentralized structure might work. Susan's arguments, nonetheless, were compelling. She had seen sections work well for the American Sociological Association and was convinced that they were necessary to accommodate LASA's growth and ensure its relevancy. Well, the rest is history. Today we have 41 sections listed on LASA's website, and they've provided the means for active membership participation, the generation of many new initiatives, and for many a path to leadership in LASA. They have not been free of conflict, and they've created new generations of problems as one would expect. But I think that they're certainly the pillar of what ensures a healthy future for LASA. So once again, congratulations to Susan for a very well-deserved honor. And thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you very much, Carmen Diana. José Luis Velasco. Roles.
It's a big honor and privilege to be here celebrating Susan Eckstein's career, my professor and friend. And I will not talk about her recent book but on Cuban migration, but rather about her first book on the poverty of revolution, which was published in 1977, and where she explains how the Mexican state, which claimed to be the continuator of a great social revolution, actually maintained large masses of Mexico City dwellers in poverty. Much has changed, of course, since that book was published, but after decades of neoliberal reform and democratic transition, the main findings of the book remain painfully relevant today. Consider the following example from chapter 3, where she analyzes what she calls the irony of organization. The state, she says, appears to be responsible to and protective of the interests of the resident poor. Residents have access to legitimate political and government organizations which espouse populist goals, but the groups provide them with no assurance that the government will act in their interests. They do acquire certain goods and services through the group, but these benefits tend to reinforce the established urban stratification, since more privileged classes receive more substantial benefits. State involvement in local communities has facilitated the extension of social forces dominating in the society at large, even though the grassroots organization convey the impression, as they do nationally, that the politically hegemonic forces operate in opposition to the dominant capitalist economic forces. In 2018, when a fierce opponent of neoliberal policies came to power in Mexico, many expected that the poor would now on be able to create and manage their own organization and fight to improve their own situation. Instead, what we have seen is a return to national populist practices. The irony of organization is still valid today with some updates. We should remark, for example, that grassroots organizations are now weaker than they were in the 1970s. We should also observe that the dominant coalition is now less cohesive, but using a classic combination of co-option, coercion, and corruption, the current government is trying to rearrange the social and economic elite to suit its own preferences. Moreover, in the dominant coalition that is being created, organized crime is a prominent member. As never before, organized criminals are helping the government control and mobilize the poor. Finally, when Eckstein wrote her book, most of the poor still live in the countryside. Now, poverty is located mainly in the cities. But that doesn't make the irony of organization less relevant. On the contrary, that irony now concerns the poor in general in Mexico. We, of course, don't know how successful today's national populist politics would be, but Eckstein's book gives us a basic lesson. The vulnerability of the poor is a precious asset for the political elite. For in fact, poverty is not only about economic deprivation, but also, and perhaps mainly, about political subordination. Thank you, Susan, for helping us understand this situation.
Thank you, Jose Luis Velasco, who's at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. Now we have Diane Davis, who's a Charles Dyer Norton Professor of Regional Development and Urbanism at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. And I guess she's an award-winning author of several books, including one that compares discipline and development, middle classes, and prosperity in East Asia and Latin America.
Hello, can you hear me? I'm going to be very quick. I know, Gerardo, we're over time. And
Yes, we are, but we can't hear you yet. I mean, I'm hearing you here, but not in the speakers. Can you talk?
yes, should I continue?
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Go for it. Yeah,
So I'm
very
going to
briefly.
be really quick because, I mean, first of all, I apologize that I'm not there, Susan, and maybe this is my punishment for not being there in person. And I know you cut me off, you know, with the microphone any moment. So so much has already, I prepared 3 pages of remarks, Susan, I'll send them to you. I'm just going to go straight to my heart, because so many wonderful things have already been said about Susan with respect to the content of her work, her leadership, the contributions to LASA. So I will be very, very sure to make 2 general remarks. One about the kind of arc of her scholarship, and I will pick up on this last presentation of our colleague Velasco to talk about Mexico. What strikes me so much and so important about Susan's work is the way she started by looking at the Mexican Revolution and then moved to another country in Latin America with the revolution, Cuba. And now she's bringing this analysis kind of not just transnationally, but back to the United States. Both the Cuban and the Mexican Revolution were big issues in the United States, and the fate of all of these countries have been intertwined in many ways in different historical moments. So one comment I would like to say about the new work that you're doing, Susan, is I'm waiting for you to start the revolution in the United States with respect to its relationship to the region, the relationship to Mexico, the relationship to Cuba. It does not go unnoticed to me that the policies, as you mentioned in your presentation, of López Obrador are part of the problem. This revolutionary regime are part of the problem of the crisis of migration and the suffering of Central Americans, other Latin Americans who are trying to come to the United States, and the transformative interactions between the two, or the regions, the back and forth of the remittances. So as usual, Susan, you are going to take us on a new direction and open new ideas for us, suggest new ideas, but you will be committed, as you always have been, with the struggle for decency and humanity. The kind of reality of how people live has always been a theme in your work. The second thing I'll say, 1 minute, is about you personally, the humanity, the kindness, and your decency. I remember meeting you as a graduate student. My advisor, Maury Zeitland, was your friend, told me the moment I arrived in Boston, you've got to see Susan Eckstein. You invited me to your office in BU, and if I remember correctly, you were either breastfeeding your second daughter, or we were talking about being a mother and a wife and an amazing scholar, or that's what I remember in my mind. And I remember thinking, I want to be Susan Eckstein. And actually, so many of the projects that you followed, I followed too. I looked at urban issues in Mexico. I looked at the earthquake. I've looked at many of the issues that you've looked at. So maybe there's something Freudian going on, but I think I was drawn to your capacity to be socially just, critic of reality, and also have some optimism that things could change. And you were so human, and you are so human in your interactions with everybody. So I would like to end as the last person to underscore why we all love you so much, Susan, is obviously your brilliance and your commitment to change and making things better, but also your human capacity to embrace us all, to inspire us all, to be humble, and to bring leadership as a woman to a discipline that really needs the kind of affect and love and kindness that you embody. So congratulations, Susan. Un gran abrazo. I'm so sorry I'm not there to be with you.
I'm so glad, Diane, that you went to your heart and brought that tremendous aspect of Susan's character. Congratulations, Susan. You make us all proud. Yeah. Thank you, everybody.